You feel it before words are even spoken, a subtle tug at your perception, a quiet manipulation threading through conversation without warning. It is so precise that you barely notice it at first. The way someone frames reality, nudges opinions, and shifts your thinking without resistance. You tell yourself they are clever, charming, persuasive, even harmless, yet an undercurrent of doubt begins to ripple through your mind. It lingers after the interaction. Small questions twisting in your head, a sense that reality has shifted slightly. Though you cannot identify how, you may believe you are immune, aware, or above such influence, yet the mind quietly responds to subtle cues long before reason engages. Every gesture, question, or compliment is calibrated, not randomly offered, and this quiet orchestration begins to feel uncomfortable, invasive, almost intimate, and the disturbing truth emerges, not about them, but about how your mind carries the patterns they exploit without even realizing. But to understand this, we need to look deeper. Because what feels like persuasion is often a mirror of your own hidden vulnerabilities. You believe that awareness alone grants immunity, that recognizing manipulation is sufficient to resist influence, and that observation equals power in every interaction. This belief is comforting because it frames manipulation as external, a threat that can be neutralized by vigilance, logic, or mental toughness alone. You tell yourself that if you notice the cues, remain cautious, and analyze their motives, you maintain control over the situation, your mind, and outcomes. You rehearse responses mentally, imagining conversations where you counter their subtle pushes, yet a lingering tension remains. An invisible pull you cannot fully suppress. You assume that manipulation succeeds only if you fall for it consciously, that recognition is protection, and awareness creates an unassailable boundary. This narrative reduces resistance, because it frames you as rational and competent, observing the manipulator from a psychological high ground that feels secure. You notice patterns, detect framing, and identify hidden intentions. Yet the mind continues to experience subtle discomfort, replaying doubts and second-guessing decisions. You assume control lies in noticing strategy, labeling behavior, and predicting outcomes, but awareness alone is incomplete, leaving blind spots that persist unseen. Even after understanding the tactics, you feel mental friction, subtle confusion, or hesitation, proving that observation does not equal mastery, and insight does not equal immunity. And this is where most people misunderstand what's really happening, because the mind's susceptibility is deeper than conscious reasoning alone can reach. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. The first unsettling truth appears quietly, that your mind responds automatically to influence long before conscious thought recognizes the pattern. Almost as if it is reflexive, you notice that even when you resist consciously, subtle shifts in attention, mood, and judgment still occur, leaving traces of manipulation without visible acknowledgement. It becomes clear that manipulation is not simply about deceit or persuasion, but about exploiting hidden mental shortcuts, biases, and emotional triggers embedded in your cognition. You replay conversations, noticing that certain words, tones, or gestures subtly shape your thinking, and a quiet doubt arises about how much control you actually have. Even analytical thought can be bent by repeated exposure to framing, context, and expectation, revealing cracks in what you believed were rational responses. You begin to question your assumptions, noticing the gap between your awareness and the invisible influence operating beneath the surface of perception. What seemed external starts to feel like a mirror, reflecting vulnerabilities, past conditioning, and unexamined expectations that manipulation quietly exploits without explicit permission. You realize that competence and vigilance are not enough, because the mind has internal loops that reinforce influence independently of conscious intention. This first crack is unsettling because it shows that awareness only exposes the pattern without dissolving it, leaving the mind partially trapped in invisible influence. And this is where we need to look deeper, because understanding the brain's learned susceptibility will reveal why manipulation feels inevitable. From early life, the brain learns patterns of response to social cues, authority, and emotional signals, encoding habits of attention and reaction that often bypass conscious thought. These patterns are reinforced by reward, recognition, and avoidance of conflict, shaping circuits that respond automatically to perceived social advantage or threat. Manipulators exploit these circuits, consciously or unconsciously, by triggering recognition patterns, subtle threats, or approval cues, causing predictable mental and emotional reactions. For example, a colleague may frame a suggestion as collaborative while quietly nudging you to accept their preferred outcome, leaving tension unrecognized in subtle compliance. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The brain treats repeated cues as reliable signals, strengthening neural pathways that support reflexive responses to an influence, making subtle manipulation easier over time. Even when you think you resist anticipatory tension, mental rehearsal and emotional nudges continue to operate, silently steering decisions before conscious reasoning engages fully. These circuits evolved for survival, detecting social threat and opportunity, maintaining safety and status. Yet in modern life they are often exploited in complex, invisible ways. Every pattern, gesture, or phrase activates learned responses, conditioning attention, emotional readiness, and cognitive evaluation to align with subtle prompts. Without overt awareness, the mind's sense of control is illusory because these learned loops operate independently of conscious insight, maintaining subtle influence long after the initial interaction. And to understand how manipulation can feel unavoidable, we need to examine the hidden payoff these patterns provide to your own brain. Within the subtle tension created by manipulation lies an unexpected reward, a mental thrill of vigilance that convinces the mind it is active, engaged, and alert. You feel justified in analyzing, predicting, and countering influence. And this rehearsal reinforces a sense of competence even as the manipulator quietly guides your thoughts. The hidden payoff is a sense of involvement, a quiet satisfaction in noticing patterns, rehearsing arguments, and maintaining mental sharpness in the face of subtle pressure. Even irritation carries reinforcement, because the brain interprets heightened attention as confirmation that it is performing well, anticipating threats, and protecting identity without conscious acknowledgement. You replay interactions mentally, correcting misperceptions and rehearsing control, and in doing so, you feed the very loop that maintains susceptibility to manipulation without provocation. Quiet moments may feel empty, and the mind unconsciously seeks tension, subtle guidance, or challenge to recreate the sense of alertness it has grown accustomed to. The payoff explains why influence lingers after awareness, why understanding manipulation does not dissolve tension, and why the mind clings to invisible loops that feel productive. It becomes uncomfortable to realize that part of the mind benefits from influence, maintaining engagement and self-affirmation even in interactions that frustrate or unsettle. Every subtle nudge, question, or framing continues to reinforce patterns because the brain has been rewarded for attention and prediction, not necessarily for accuracy or autonomy. And this is where it becomes unsettling, because the mind's response is self-reinforcing, creating the illusion of control while quietly sustaining manipulation. Over time, responding to manipulation becomes part of self-concept, a familiar and stabilizing identity, rehearsed automatically in every subtle interaction. Without conscious decision, you begin to say, "You are vigilant, discerning, and alert," framing your reactions as principled, while the loop quietly sustains itself in the background. This identity offers comfort, a predictable script for recognizing influence, anticipating behaviors, and rehearsing mental defenses that feel reliable but are largely unconscious before conversations. Even start mental preparation occurs, rehearsing responses, analyzing potential manipulation, and maintaining internal readiness as if provocation is inevitable. For example, you notice a friend casually framing a story to elicit agreement, and tension rises internally before a word is spoken, rehearsing rebuttals in your head. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The reaction has become automatic because identity now reinforces the loop, making preemptive anticipation a default response to subtle social cues. Logic alone cannot undo this pattern, because it is no longer about external behavior but about maintaining a stable, familiar self-concept that feels safe. If you resist the pattern, uncertainty and vulnerability surface, revealing that the identity has quietly habituated the mind to constant engagement with potential influence. The trap is invisible, because it masquerades as competence, alertness, and rational vigilance while continuing to feed the same loops that manipulators exploit. And this is where most people fail to see that the real challenge is internal, not external, because identity itself sustains susceptibility. What if manipulation is never truly about the other person, but entirely about the patterns your own mind carries, waiting quietly to be activated by subtle cues? The manipulator becomes less a threat and more reflection, a mirror revealing habitual loops, emotional triggers, and conditioned responses long rehearsed without awareness. Attention shifts from trying to control them to observing yourself, noticing how every nudge, question, or suggestion activates familiar pathways without judgment or resistance. What once felt like pressure now becomes information, a demonstration of hidden mental architecture, a chance to witness loops that previously went unexamined. You start to see subtle influence as neutral, like weather passing through awareness, leaving patterns visible but not compelling action, creating distance between impulse and reaction. Internal rehearsal dissolves as observation takes over and curiosity replaces tension, because the mind now witnesses influence rather than absorbing it, quieting familiar friction. You notice that the loops can be observed without collapse, and the rehearsed identity no longer dictates reaction, creating a calm space for choice without compulsion. Interactions remain the same externally, but internally the mind is free to watch patterns without ownership, without urgency, and without internal escalation. Manipulation ceases to feel like personal attack, and provocation is reframed as insight into hidden mental structures, subtle vulnerabilities, and conditioned attention. And this is where perspective shifts completely, because observing without attachment allows awareness to dismantle the invisible architecture of influence without force. Calm emerges gradually as tension loses its dominance, and the mind learns to notice provocation without gripping, rehearsing, or preparing defenses against imagined threats. You feel subtle awareness rising, noticing gestures, words, and framing as they occur, without assigning personal significance or urgency, just observing patterns quietly. Even repeated provocations no longer trigger reflexive rehearsal, because the mind begins to distinguish between signal and threat, noticing loops without activating them automatically. Moments of irritation or tension appear, then fade, leaving the mind unhooked from familiar compulsion, as if stepping back from a current without struggling against it. Observation becomes habitual, and internal rehearsal diminishes, creating space between input and reaction, between subtle influence and personal engagement. Revealing clarity previously hidden, you recognize that calm is not suppression, but the ability to witness influence without internalizing it. Quietly noting the patterns and loops at play, subtle freedom rises because the mind no longer has to participate in every provocation, no longer feeds every loop, and no longer rehearses every scenario, and this is where change becomes invisible yet real. Because the mind begins to experience autonomy quietly, almost imperceptibly, without external proof or drama. As you reflect, it becomes clear that the manipulator never held true power, only highlighted the hidden structures, loops, and vulnerabilities within your own mind. Every subtle nudge, framed question, and suggestion is mirrored back, showing patterns of attention, expectation, and emotional response that quietly operate beneath awareness. You notice that tension, irritation, and rehearsal were not imposed externally, but cultivated internally by habits and identity that the mind has reinforced over time. Observation replaces reaction, and curiosity replaces compulsion, allowing you to witness influence without internalizing it, revealing a quiet autonomy that previously felt impossible. Even when manipulation occurs, it no longer dictates experience because the mind has learned to recognize, observe, and detach from loops that once carried urgency. You realize that freedom is subtle, emerging not from confrontation or argument, but from noticing invisible patterns, allowing them to exist without engagement or internal escalation. And in this mirror, you see yourself not as a target, but as an observer of patterns, loops, and influence, quietly aware, calmly present, and internally untangled. Outsmarting manipulators is never about them, but about noticing hidden loops, internalized responses, and rehearsed identity patterns that quietly guide behavior without permission. Each interaction reveals conditioning, subtle rewards, and habitual engagement, and observing them is the only way to reclaim mental autonomy without forcing external change. The next subtle nudge may seem yet the mind can respond differently with awareness, observation, and quiet curiosity rather than automatic rehearsal or compulsion. Watch closely, notice the invisible architecture of influence, and allow observation to replace struggle, curiosity to replace tension, and presence to replace reflexive engagement. And as you continue exploring these patterns, more hidden structures of thought and behavior will quietly emerge, leaving questions only attentive awareness can answer.